Hello, welcome to Canon Law in Exile. This is video 5, and we are going to be talking about more about specific crimes and penalties, but we today are going to be talking about what are called grave or more grave delicts or more serious crimes, and these are dealt with not in the code, or not only in the code of canon law, but also in this more recent document called SST, Sacramentorum, sanctitatis, tutela, to protect the holiness of the sacraments. It was originally promulgated by John Paul II in 2001, and was later revised by him in 2003 and by Pope Benedict in 2010. So today we're mostly going to be talking about SST. SST and the code deal with some of the same delicts, but SST will essentially give us new procedures for these very serious crimes. We're talking about basically about 7 serious crimes, and also will reserve some of them. The ones that SST talks about are now reserved to the Holy See, specifically to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Some of those delicts were reserved to the Holy See in the code, but not all of them. So we'll talk about those. Okay, before we do that though, why did we need SST? Um, a number of the readings that you have discuss this, and especially discuss the role of Cardinal Ratzinger. If you read the essay by Bishop Juan Ignacio Arrieta, that was the 2010 essay, it was all about then Cardinal Ratzinger's role in the advocating the reform of canon law as early as 1988. Not just canon law, but specifically Book 6, the penal section. Why? What was the problem? Again, very interesting what Arrieta has told us about then Cardinal Ratzinger, because we're only 5 years into the new code in 1988, and already Cardinal Ratzinger has found some things that he has found very difficult to deal with. Keep in mind that his dicastery, formerly known as the Holy Office, now the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, has judicial competence in some crimes. So he's interested in this subject, not just for general interest, but because he actually is dealing with some of these issues. Well, one of the things that he talks about, now this is Cardinal Ratzinger, or I'm sorry, Pope Emeritus Benedict, writing in 2019, just exactly a year ago, where he's giving his reflections on the causes of the sexual abuse crisis, and you have that document too. And he discusses what he calls guarantorism, and what he describes this as is the desire which he sees in the code to guarantee the rights of the accused at all costs. He suggests that perhaps the code goes too far in protecting the rights of the accused and makes it too difficult to actually apply penalties. Another theme in Cardinal Ratzinger's, in Pope Benedict's reflections, but also in then Cardinal Ratzinger's accomplishment of his duties at the CDF, has to do with decentralization. As you know, there was a lot of decentralization at Vatican II, or one of the themes of Vatican II is decentralization, where the bishops essentially, the local bishops, diocesan bishops, essentially become more significant in the wake of Vatican II. And this is a big theme with penal law because the idea in the 1983 code is that the local bishops are going to apply penal law. And what frustrates Cardinal Ratzinger in the 1980s is that the local bishops do not seem to be doing that. So decentralization is going to be another theme. Um, what's interesting also is that the next year, 1989, there is a new document that, not just a document, but a new reorganization of the Roman Curia by John Paul II. And he does this through an apostolic constitution called Pastor Bonus. Very important document. Pastor Bonus is still the law. It basically says what the competency of each of the dicasteries of the Holy See is. And in this document, it looks like some of Cardinal Ratzinger's suggestions were taken to heart, because the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is given, it already had some judicial competence, but it's given additional competence. So it now will be able to judge not only crimes connected with the faith, but also the more serious crimes connected with the sacraments and with morals. So that's a big development with Pastor Bonus. We don't find out exactly what those crimes are, though. We don't find out what the specific crimes are that CDF will be judging for 12 years, though. We don't find that out until SST. Then we learn that there's going to be these more grave delicts, and that's what we'll be talking about today. What are the more serious crimes that the CDF will be judging? Okay, I should mention one other thing. One other phenomenon that is mentioned when we're talking about the 1970s and 1980s is what is sometimes called the therapeutic approach. And what this means, this is discussed in the article, the Boston College Law Review article by Father John Coughlin. That is one of your readings or suggested readings for Lesson 6. And the therapeutic approach basically means that what the bishops, this goes back to that idea of decentralization, where the code seems to be looking to the local bishops to apply the law, but what the local bishops end up doing in, say, the 1970s and 1980s is embracing a therapeutic approach over the application of the actual law. So instead of inflicting penalties on clerics who commit sexual crimes, they usually send them for psychological treatment in the hope and expectation that that treatment is going to render them suitable for ministry again. So this is therapeutic idea is another key theme when we're discussing this era, at least to the mid 1980s, and probably beginning, say, the era from the end of the Vatican Council, 1965, until probably 1985. Okay, what are the crimes that we're talking about here? Most of the crimes that are dealt with in SST are crimes against the sacraments. And most of them already are at least discussed in the code, but SST is going to tell us more about them. The main thing SST is doing, though, is reserving this group of crimes to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. One of the crimes is desecration of the Eucharist. Now that already was reserved to the Holy See. The penalty for that crime is a late sententiae excommunication, as we discussed last time. Another crime against the Eucharist, simulation of the celebration of the Eucharist. Simulation. That means you're attempting to celebrate the Eucharist even though you're not a priest. The penalty for this is a late sententiae interdict, and it's a suspension if you're a member of the clergy, basically if you're a deacon. In the code, simulation of the Eucharist was not reserved to the Holy See, but it is going to be reserved to CDF in SST. Okay, prohibited concelebration. This is basically concelebration of the Mass with ministers who do not have full communion. That was a crime in the code, still is, but it was not reserved. Now, this is an interesting one because part of that crime has been reserved to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. If you celebrate with a Protestant minister, a minister that belongs to a community that does not have apostolic succession and does not recognize the sacramentality of the priesthood, if that's who you concelebrate with, then the crime is reserved to the CDF. If you concelebrate with a priest who does have whose church, say an Orthodox priest, who does have apostolic succession and who does recognize the sacramentality of the priesthood, then it's still a delict, but it's no longer reserved to the Apostolic See. Okay. Also, another crime against the Eucharist, consecrating the Eucharistic species improperly. Basically, consecrating with a sacrilegious intention is another crime now reserved to the CDF. And this is mentioned in the code, though I don't think it's mentioned in the penal canons. It's mentioned in Canon 927. Okay, so most of these are four crimes against the Eucharist. Most of them were not reserved under the original code, but are reserved to CDF now in SST. Okay, let's move on to crimes against the sacrament of penance. Now, if you're following in Woodall, we're around page 488. And now we're going up to 490 with crimes against the sacrament of penance. Okay, there are three crimes against the sacrament of penance. One is absolution of an accomplice. The penalty is a late sententiae excommunication, and I should say the crime is attempted absolution of an accomplice. What type of accomplice? An accomplice in a sexual sin. So if the priest has committed a sexual sin with a person, then the crime is after that encounter, the priest attempts to absolve his partner in that crime. Why do we say attempt? Because as we spoke about last time, the absolution is invalid unless the accomplice is in danger of death. Okay, the next one, solicitation in the confessional. Again, solicitation to commit a sin against the sixth commandment, or contra sextum. This was not a reserved crime in the code, but it now is reserved in SST. And this crime is punished according to the gravity of the offense. And finally, direct violation of the seal of confession. This already was a reserved delict in the code. The penalty is late sententiae excommunication, and now with SST, it's still reserved to the Holy See, but specifically to CDF. That direct violation of the seal, that is a good one to actually know the penalty for, as we said last time. Okay, so we've just talked about 4 crimes against the Eucharist and 3 crimes against the Sacrament of Penance. Those are most of the crimes that SST deals with. They're crimes against the sacraments, plus 1 additional crime, 1 crime against morals, which is a crime with a minor. Basically, this is sexual abuse of a minor by a member of the clergy. Now, so now this crime is reserved to the CDF. Under the original code, it was not a reserved delict. And there's several other changes. This crime in the code is discussed in Canon 1395, Section 2. And in the original code, the crime was a sexual crime with a minor under the age of 16. Now, with SST, the age is raised to 18. So the crime is with a minor under the age of 18. Competence, as we said, now has changed. Now the delict is reserved. It's reserved to CDF specifically. And again, it's still punished according to the gravity of the offense. At least that's what the law says. And the kind of most serious sanction is dismissal from the clerical state. Woodall on 491 talks about a possible diversity of punishments based on the gravity of the offense, though it seems in practice like if there is a proven delict along these lines, that it's quite common that the cleric will be dismissed from the clerical state. Okay, so those are our crimes now, 8 crimes that we're concerned with, and we're going to talk more about grave delicts, but especially about the delict against morals, the abuse of a minor. And this leads us into what is called prescription. Now, prescription means really 2 things in canon law. We're only going to talk about one of them. What it basically means is how much time the sort of the prosecutor in the church, the promoter of justice, has to bring an action against the offender. What we would call in civil law the statute of limitations is what prescription means. So in the original 1983 code, the prescriptive period was 5 years. And then in 1994, it was extended to 10 years. And when SST came around in 2001, the 10-year period was reaffirmed. And but then, as you see, there was a revision, 2 revisions to SST, one in 2003, one in 2010. And in 2010, the prescriptive period was extended to 20 years. So in the original code, it's 5 years. The church authority has 5 years to prosecute the crime. Starting in 1994, the period is 10 years. I believe that 10-year period was for the U.S. and for Ireland. I don't think it was church-wide, but then in 2001, with the original SST, the 10-year period became church-wide. And then in 2010, the period became 20 years. Not only that, though, not only is the period much longer now, 20 years to prosecute, but also the CDF can derogate from the 20-year period. That means essentially it can lift the 20-year period and allow prosecution of an offense even if it is more than 20 years ago. I think this is a key issue and it is one that some of the critics of the church's penal law talk about a lot. One of your readings is from Cardinal Avery Dulles, and in the article that you have, which is from 2004, he talks about this, and he also talks about the uh, what he calls the dangers of allowing very long prescriptive periods. Basically, he thinks that it's unfair to the accused because the memories of the witnesses fade and it becomes harder for the accused to defend himself, and more likely that there will be a conviction even if it is not supported by the evidence. So this is, as you're writing your thought pieces on penal law, the prescriptive period might be one to discuss. Um, Keep in mind it's extended a lot. It started at 5 years in the 1983 code, then about 10 years later went to 10 years, and then in 2001 to 20 years, and now with SST it not only is a long period now, it's 20 years, but also in specific cases the CDF can derogate. Basically, the reservation to derogate from the 20-year period is if it's a particularly serious case. Okay. Another issue that is somewhat, again, another one you might wish to write about in connection with your think piece on penal law is if you look at SST, the actual norms for SST, Article 21 says that the judicial process is presumed, that in the main, we're going to prosecute these crimes using the judicial process. However, it says that the CDF can allow the use of an administrative procedure. Sometimes you'll see the word extrajudicial as opposed to judicial. If you see extrajudicial, that just means administrative. What's the difference? We talked about this previously, but basically the judicial process is longer and more complicated, but it's better at protecting the rights of the accused. The administrative procedure is shorter and quicker, easier, but not as protective of the rights of the accused. So that might be another focus of do you think this is good? We should move the cases along. Are you more concerned with moving the cases along quickly? If so, then you will be a proponent of using the administrative procedure more. If you're afraid that we're getting convictions of people who may not be guilty, then you would be an advocate of sticking more to the sort of the original presumption that we're usually going to use the judicial process more often. Woodall at 491 talks about some special faculties given to the Congregation for the Clergy. This happened, I think, in 2009, and they're basically cases of clergy in irregular situations and trying to find a way to sort of wrap up those cases, though there's some controversy here too. One of the scenarios is if a cleric has attempted marriage uh, and he's persisting in a scandalous life, essentially living with a person who he's treating as his wife, but who is not really his wife. If he's been warned, or if he's seriously violating the sixth commandment in another way, that's one scenario that is dealt with. Another scenario is Canon 1399. That's our catch-all canon, so that might be a number of other uh, fact situations that don't fit into the ones that we've discussed previously. And then our third situation is a cleric who has abandoned ministry for more than 5 years. And what happened in 2009 is that the Congregation for the Clergy was given faculties to dismiss clerics in these situations, even without a judicial process. I said this is kind of controversial. That's because the code says, and I believe this is Canon 1342, that a perpetual expiatory penalty cannot be inflicted except with a judicial process. Well, dismissal from the clerical state is a perpetual expiatory penalty, and yet we see kind of this creeping extension of the extrajudicial or administrative procedure to allow dismissal from the clerical state even without a judicial process. So that's again an issue that you may wish to give some thought about and think if you would like to discuss that in your thought piece. Okay, that wraps up SST and the grave delicts. Next time we're going to talk about the Dallas Charter and the essential norms and our other readings, such as the a little bit more about our readings from Dulles and Coghlan, which we talked about somewhat in this video, and also the reading from Sarah MacDonald about the Irish priest, Father Hazelwood or Hazelton, who was falsely accused, and it took 6 years for him to clear his name. Thank you very much.